sinners return to him, that he may revive us, that he may restore us.
It's in 1 Samuel chapter 3, verse 21. The Lord continued to appear at Shiloh, and there he revealed himself to Samuel. Then guess what the next three words are? Through his word. I thought that was really interesting because at that time, the only word they would have would have been the Pentateuch, the first 5 books of Moses. That's all they would have had. And that was how God revealed himself to Samuel. And I thought, what a great reminder for us that God reveals himself through his word. Of course, there are many other ways, and we see him revealing himself as in dreams and visions and all sorts of things through the Bible. But I think we ought not to lose sight of the fact that very often he will reveal himself to us through his word. You know, I'm really excited about what the Lord has shown me in terms of what my word for this year is. And as I was thinking about it, I went back into Exodus, but I'll tell you why I went back there. Throughout Christmas, I've been reading some Christian novels. And throughout Christmas, I felt as though the Lord was saying, spiritual battle, spiritual battle, spiritual battle, spiritual battle. Kept getting this over and over again, and I would have it confirmed. And it didn't matter what I read. I would be reading something else about a spiritual confrontation, a spiritual battle. And it was as though I was feeling that the Lord was saying, this is your word for 2022. But it didn't rest there. And so what happened was, as I began to unpack it, I began to realize that what the Lord was showing me was that possessing the land involves to a very large extent being willing to recognize that it's a spiritual battle that we're in. And so what happened was I went back and was reminded that Moses was 80 years old when he took him before Pharaoh with Aaron. He was 80 years old. For most of us, the life has already been lived. And of course, for Moses, a lot of that had been spent in the deserts of Midian because he had run from Pharaoh because he had killed the Egyptian. And the Lord reminded me, he said, Ron, did you ever think about the fact that I chose a murderer to take out the people from Egypt? I chose a murderer. Like most of us, I hope, would be able to say, well, we committed lots of sins, but we're not murderers. He was a murderer. He had killed somebody. And I thought to myself, wow, there's a huge lesson just in that God is not a respecter of persons. God does not look at our past. When he says that you've been redeemed, he means you've been redeemed. When a person turns to God, that person is as though he's been washed white as snow, because the Lord is saying, I'm accepting you just the way you are. Now let's move forward. And so I felt as though the Lord was saying, so I want you to recognize this was no saint that I was bringing here. This was no saint. Just because he was brought up in the courts of Pharaoh as royalty didn't mean that he was greater than. He was a murderer, for goodness sakes. And so I think we need to just be aware of the fact that the qualifications in order for us to be used of God are that God finds us to be acceptable in his sight, and that it requires a change of our hearts. It just requires that the condition of our heart be entirely renewed. So I went through the book and I noticed a couple of things, and I'm just going to mention them to you. One of the things that I mentioned was that, or I noticed rather, was that in preparing Moses, as you are well aware, he didn't want to be the guy. He says, why are you picking me? Why me? Why would you choose me? I can't even express myself well. And God said, well, don't worry about it. I'll figure that one out. And what he did was he told him that he would like to use Aaron to be his the person that would do the, if you like, the interpreting for him. And so he did that. And one of the things that happened was that he spoke to Aaron, and then Aaron spoke to the leaders of Israel. Do you know what they did? Aaron actually demonstrated the miracles before the leaders. Did you know that? Aaron actually took the rod, threw it down, showed them that it became a snake, and picked it back up. He actually did that to convince them, oh, by the way, I want you to know this really is God. I'm not just making these things up. And he actually demonstrated the miracles, which I had not noticed before. Of course, we all know about the miracles, but I thought that what happened was that God spoke to Moses, said, throw it down, it became a snake, and that was Moses okay to go do the same for Egypt. But there was actually an in-between happening, and that was that in telling the story to Israel, they were convinced not just by the words, but by the reality of the miracle in front of them. And they said, oh, okay, I guess this has to be God. And so they performed the signs, and that was why they believed that God was leading them. The other thing that happened was during this whole process, Pharaoh was getting pretty darn antsy because Israel wanted to be able to go and worship the Lord. So they asked for time off, if you like. They asked to be able to go into the desert and worship God. And Pharaoh's response was, not only are you not going to go into the desert, but I'm not going to give you any more straw to make bricks. You're trying to tell me that you want to go worship your God, and I think you're just being downright lazy. And so very often what happens is in the natural, we find ourselves needing so much that is not available to us. And in doing that, in finding ourselves in those situations, often what God is saying is, don't look to what you need in the natural, look to me. You've been calling out for me to be your redeemer. You've been calling out for me to provide you someone that'll take you out. All that you can see is what's happening in the natural, but what I want you to see is what I will do for you. And so it was being demonstrated in the natural that they had less and less and less. And what God was going to do was to show them in the spiritual what he could do. So the other thing that I noticed, and this was, I guess, a lot of these things I hadn't noticed before. So I'm talking to you as a child in Sunday school would, because these are things that I am learning. And one of the things that I recognized as I was going through it, in Exodus 6:3, said, God said, I did not make myself known to your forefathers the way I'm making myself known to you. Oh my gosh, we're talking about Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And he's saying to Moses, they didn't know me the way you're going to know me. They didn't know me in the personal way. They didn't know my name. They didn't know I am the I am. And they didn't know what was involved in knowing who I am. And that struck me because of where I believe the Lord is taking us with this teaching, that he is showing us who he is in greater and greater and greater measure as we come closer to the time when his son is going to return. We're getting to see more and more and more of the hugeness of who our God is. And I had not noticed that. And I thought it was incredibly significant that at this particular time, God was saying, just fix your eyes on me and watch, because even your forefathers didn't know what I'm going to be showing you. Then the other thing was, he said, I am the Lord of your people. I am going to redeem them. I am going to bring them out. That was the message that he was giving Moses. And that was the message that Moses was to give Israel, that he was going to bring them out. So he wanted them, at least in part, to understand that he was going to be the Lord, their Redeemer. And that was really important because it's a reflection, I believe, of what he wants us to know today as well. And then finally, he's saying to them, I have prepared a land. And what's really interesting about this is he actually states that the land is already inhabited by other peoples. And he goes through a list of all of the tribes that are in the land. And he says, but I have prepared this land for you. And so I think it's important that we hear this teaching, if you like, that God, in his sovereignty, knows exactly what he's going to do and how he's going to do it, in spite of the fact that in the natural, there's no way that Israel could have understood it. Because what they saw was anything but being released, being given an inheritance that would see them come to be a nation. It was nothing like that. If they looked at the position they were in, miracles or no miracles, it was really hard for them to imagine what God was going to do. And it's where I want to bring us this year. It's where I want to bring us as we consider where God has got us this year. To begin, let me tell you that what the Lord did was to bring to mind the two stories of Moses and the Exodus and Joshua and Jericho. And here's why. What lies ahead for Moses and for Joshua in both of those circumstances was entirely spiritual. None of it was to be of their own making. Moses was to bring Israel out, but his role was just to speak the words of God. And very often the words of God would be, just point your staff over the water, and what God does is separates the waters. What God does is he leads them in and he says, now cross over. And as Israel cross over, all they're doing is obeying God. And before you know it, Egypt's coming after them. And then God says, let the waters engulf them. So all that Israel did was obey God. They actually didn't do anything of themselves. Nothing was done in their own strength. To multiply the imagery, when we think about Joshua and Jericho, God says, I'm going to give you the city. And this is what I'm going to do. I want you to take 7 priests. I want you to give them 7 trumpets. I want to put them in front of the ark. I want to put the ark in front of the people. I want you to walk around the city 7 times. And when you've done that, then I want you to have everybody cry, shout out, and see what I will do. What was Israel doing? They were simply obeying what God told them to do. And none of it made any sense. I mean, really think about it. You generally go with an army. And so what happened was when an army assaults a city, normally what happens is they breach the wall. There's a breach, usually in one of the weakest parts, perhaps where the doors are. They get it down, and you've seen all the movies with the rams where they're battering the doors and the doors open and the people above with hot tar, pouring tar down on the soldiers, and the soldiers are dying left, right, and center. But eventually they break the door down and the army goes through. Not so in Jericho. In Jericho, there was no breach. The whole freaking wall came down everywhere. There was no breach to be made. God just said, it's yours, and down it comes. And all of Israel goes in and takes the city. The imagery here is, excuse me, you don't have to do anything. Just watch me. Just follow my lead and do as I tell you to do. These battles, and in the case of Moses, of course, it was hardly a battle, although it certainly would have seemed that way to Israel. But it wasn't a battle as much as it was a spiritual undertaking that God was saying, I'm going to do this. And the way I want to do this is to partner with you. What do you have to do? What is your responsibility? One, I don't want you to look at the natural around you, because the natural will defy what I'm telling you I'm going to do. You won't believe it in the natural. It doesn't make any sense. Secondly, I need you to be willing to surrender your heart to me. That will mean that you are prepared to believe what I tell you. Now, when it came to the Israelites, Aaron actually went in and did the miracles. So it made it a little bit easier for them to surrender their hearts, because they saw it and they trusted. Actually, for you and I, he is not generally inclined to turn the staff into snakes. Generally speaking, it's a little bit less dramatic for us, but this principle remains the same. He wants us to surrender our hearts. Then he wants us to be able to say, once I'm surrendered, I will be obedient to the call. Now, this is really important, and it applies to all of you watching this. The reason obedience is important is because obedience is a particular anointing that is given to a leader. That obedience is something that you stand on and will not move off your square, because the people that you lead are forever going to say, oh, I don't think we can do this. I don't think we can go in there. I think there's too many enemies in the land. I think there's no way we can take this. But as the leader, we are called to trust and obey. Trust and obey is the New Testament definition for the fear of the Lord. When we are willing to obey, God says, as my chosen instrument, you need to recognize that large part of the greatest responsibility you carry is to walk out that obedience, because those who follow you are going to want to change their minds. Those who follow you are going to become weak of heart. They are going to say, I don't know. Are you sure? You sure this is God? Are you sure we can do this? And God is saying, no. First of all, I want you to surrender your heart to me. Once you've done that, then I want you to decide that you are going to trust and obey. And that doesn't mean just today. That means tomorrow and the next day and the day after that. And sometimes you're going to look in the natural and you're not going to see what you think you should see. And I'm still going to ask you to trust and obey. And then he said, the other thing is that I will want you to have absolute faith, because very often what you're going to see will fly in the face of what you see in the natural. Because what happens in the spiritual does not match up with what's happening in the natural. And he gave me a really good example of that. And I felt as though it was a revelation. He said to me, Ron, look and see what's happened over the last 2 years with COVID. Look and see what's happened in the natural with all of the different points of view that have been raised up. Look and see how nobody trusts anybody else. Look and see how it's happened in government. Look and see how it's happened in the media. Look and see how it's happened in the health system. Look and see how it's happened amongst our legal leaders. Nothing in the natural makes sense. Said the minute you take your natural glasses off and begin to look through the spiritual, then you begin to see things starting to make sense. God is looking to raise up a people who seek after his heart and are not looking to try to find understanding in the things of this world. When we look at the last 2 years, I defy anybody to tell me they can understand what's happening. It makes no sense. And that's very well and good. But what God wants us to understand is that what happens in the natural is very often a very opposite reflection of what's happening in the spirit. What happens in the spirit does not generally line up with what happens in the natural. And that's one of the reasons why he's asking us to trust him implicitly, because we dare not trust what we see. We dare not trust what we see. Most of it makes no sense. And if we try logically using our brain to follow it through, we'll become as confused as everybody else out there. And God's saying, don't. Look to me. Trust me. Obey me. Surrender to me. Love me. And then finally, one of the things that he wants us to recognize is that his purpose in asking us to look at the spiritual is that he wants to reveal. By giving us the opportunity to have eyes to see in the spiritual, what he's saying is, I want to give you eyes to see, because those in the world have not been equipped with spiritual eyes, and they're not going to see, and I need you to know my purpose. My purpose is redemption. I want others to be touched by your lives. And as they see you lead, as they see you bring wisdom to the circumstance, they are going to recognize that there's a place of meaning, there's a place of safety that makes sense beyond anything that they see or they understand. And for those people who choose to hear the words that we bring, redemption follows. And they're removed from amongst the fray. They're removed from amongst the battle. We need to be looking to receive the Ruths of this world, who in Jericho said, let me put out the red scarf. And God said, fine, if you make that decision now through Joshua said, we will make sure when the walls fall, your whole family is protected. And that's exactly what happened. Redemption comes through trusting the word of the Lord, that comes through those who have spiritual eyes and are able to see beyond what seems to be happening in the natural. And so when I asked the Lord, Father, what does it mean that we are to possess the land? He said, I'm going to give you the land. You're going to possess the land, but you're going to possess it because of what's happening in the spiritual, not because of what's happening in the natural. This year, what lies ahead is going to be an incredibly spiritual year in terms of the encounters, the things that we come across. Much, if not all, I believe that the Lord is calling us to, is to say, it doesn't matter what comes your way. I want you to stop by being transformed by the renewing of your mind. Romans 12:2. Stop looking at what you see in the natural and ask me to enable you to see it through spiritual glasses. Jericho wasn't taken by a breach in the wall. The whole wall collapsed. Moses didn't have to escape with the people of Israel from Egypt. The Egyptians couldn't see them go fast enough. And when they left, God had already prepared them to know. He had told the women of Israel, by the way, this is before any of the plagues, before any of the 10 plagues, it was 10, not 12. Any of the plagues, he said, get ready to take the wealth of Egypt with you. None of that would have made any sense. They were told to be gathering straw, making bricks without straw. And now God's saying, oh, by the way, when you leave, you're going to be taking all the wealth with you. What are you talking about? This makes no sense. But God knew, and he was preparing hearts. And so for 2022, in order to be able to possess the land, I believe the Lord wants our hearts to be prepared. First of all, he wants us to know that he has prepared a place for us to be able to walk into in spite of anything that we see with our spiritual eyes. And so by being transformed by the renewing of our mind, What I believe the Lord is asking us to do this year is to ask him to help us to renew our approach. That it doesn't matter what comes against us. He wants us to begin being so purposeful about the way that we consider the things of this world. And he's asking us, please put on spiritual glasses. We in 6:3 it says that I made myself known, and I have made myself known, and am making myself known to you in ways that I did not make myself known to your fathers. I believe it's a word for us now. I believe the Lord is saying, I am going to reveal more and more and more of who I am, so that you will be so fully equipped to possess the land, but it will not be because of your strength or because of anything that you bring to the table. It will be because you are willing to trust and obey. And in order to do that, I will equip you with greater and greater understanding. But it will mean that you have to lean in closer than you've ever leaned in the past. Because to have spiritual eyes means that you and I, speaking of God and ourselves, have to walk arm in arm. We literally have to be so close to him that it's literally impossible that we would miss what he wants to show us. Isn't it interesting that God gave Moses Aaron, and when he did, Aaron was given as a prophet. He was given as somebody who would speak prophetic words to the people. I believe that God is raising up those who have a heart to follow him as prophets in this time. And when I say prophets, I mean it in the loosest sense of the word, because to be a prophet of God is simply to know God's heart, to be able to speak it out to others. When we know God's heart, when we know God's intention, when we know God's purposes, we're able to speak it out to others with such incredibly great confidence that when it's received by others, they'll say, wow, that's a prophetic word. That sounds to me like a prophetic word. They'll recognize it to be a prophetic word. And where does that come from? It comes from the sense that we are so close with our God that we understand where he's taking us in the spiritual, and it won't make any sense in the natural. But when we speak it out, others will receive it as truth, because they'll recognize it in the spirit. Those whom God has prepared will recognize it in the spirit. So I believe that the Lord is about to bring a tidal wave of spiritual encounters, spiritual opportunities to those who have been prepared, made ready, and available to be used by him. I think that 22 is going to be a year unlike any other for those of us who are willing to be used in such a way. But we have definitely come to a place, I believe, where God is saying, in order to possess the land, you require to renew your minds, because you can no longer do this in your strength. You can no longer do this in your power. And just go and look at the past. They didn't take these cities by power. They didn't take these cities by strength. It was supernatural undertaking. And for Israel, when they went through these journeys, they didn't understand it. It required a Moses. It required a Joshua. It required a Samuel who could look beyond the natural and understand that this is not about us. This is about God. So for us to possess the land, I believe that the Lord wants us to know that we have entered a new time that so many others will not understand. And God is looking for those of us who have a heart and who have a desire for him to stand in the gap and to lead them forward in such a way that God will redeem many.
Come, let us worship him, that we may seek him, that he may bless us. If we press on to